I'm really happy to be here. So the way that I've structured this presentation is to illustrate the evolution of my work or my practice over the past 2 decades. And let me share my screen. So my work of the past several years has been predominantly textile based, but I wanted to preface that textile work by first speaking about drawing and painting and how they've influenced my process and thinking, and to also show that despite the differences in materials and processes, there's still a common conceptual thread that's interwoven throughout the work over the course of the past 20 years. And so I've broken this presentation down into 4 distinct categories. Part 1 is dealing with drawing, part 2 is painting, part 3, textiles, and then part 4 is currently weaving. And so I moved to New York City in September of 2000, just after a residency at Skowhegan. And at the time, I couldn't afford a studio. So my bedroom was my studio. And so the space of my bedroom, but more specifically, the desk in my bedroom dictated what I would make and the scale of the work. And so it led me to make small works on paper with graphite, some charcoal, but mostly graphite. And it was a practical and clean way for me to make work on a small scale with relatively little mess and just a pencil and paper. And so the first few years in New York City were very much a learning experience for me. And I basically retaught myself how to draw. And so throughout the course of this presentation, I'm going to speak about game changers for me. And so, right now, I'm going to speed through this first section of drawings, which really encompasses 10 years of work, but I'm only going to point out several game-changing drawings, which I feel like have shifted the trajectory of my work throughout the years. And so this is the very first drawing that I made when I moved to New York City. And it's in this drawing, I superimposed my facial features onto each person on the page of my high school yearbook, and it's called The Flock. And it's actually this drawing right here hanging up behind me. And the common conceptual thread that runs throughout all of my past and present work begins here with this drawing. So in this drawing, it's the use of the grid, repetition, mirroring, symmetry, thinking about sameness versus difference, thinking about the original versus the copy, thinking about perception, how deceptive perception could be, and then also thinking about identity in general, and more specifically about queerness, also the individual versus the group, and then thinking also about assimilation as a form of camouflage and invisibility, and then also racism. And here's a detail. So this is another game-changing series for me, and it's called Make Them Love You. And so in 2003, I came out to my parents, and I made this drawing directly afterwards, and I called it Make Them Love You. And for me, this was a significant work, and it was a turning point for me. Making this was deeply personal and vulnerable, and it came from my lived experience. And it was empowering, and it gave me the courage to finally speak and live my truth. And so this became a series and the subject for my first solo exhibition in 2004 at Jeff Bailey Gallery in Chelsea. So that was my first solo exhibition, 2004. I moved to New York in 2000. So for 4 years, I had just been making a bunch of drawings, right? And so 2004, I showed this series, and I was using this microphone as the subject, and it implied for me, the desire for an audience to communicate and to amplify one's voice and to be heard. The microphones became stand-ins for people. They became characters. So they were standing, they felt like they were bowing down, hovering, getting tangled, or reaching towards the person before them. And so different types of microphones suggested certain time periods and usages, and for politics or for entertainment. And what I ended up doing was I erased the speakers, the performers, the audience, and I just left the microphones to inhabit their own pristine space. So even though the original content and the meaning was personal to me, my coming out, to my lived experience, it was still open-ended enough for viewers to come to their own conclusions. or associations. This is a diptych that I made in 2006, also another game changer for me. So one morning in 2006, I went to the bodega and saw the front page of the Daily News. And it depicted this image of a tourist who was a victim of a stabbing on the C train. And so the composition of the photo and the way the EMTs were lowering the victim onto this gurney reminded me of this Caravaggio painting, The Atonement of Christ, on the left. And so I just, I like the idea of these two things sort of mirroring each other, but they were from two totally different periods, right? Two totally different times, et cetera. And so it was an uncanny moment of an image repeating itself, but in completely different contexts. And, thinking about this idea of sameness versus difference, and also the title was pointing out to the coincidence with the C train and C for Caravaggio. And so this was the original painting, the Caravaggio painting that I was referencing there. So a lot of my aesthetic thinking has been shaped by music and by religion. Music, prior to studying art, I was a classical pianist, and I originally attended VCU to study music performance and composition. And then with religion, religious iconography and experience, I was raised Catholic, went to a Catholic school, surrounded by religious imagery and rituals throughout my life. My mom was a nun before she met my dad. And growing up, we would recite the rosary at night and on road trips. And so in this drawing, I made this drawing, and on each beat of the rosary, there's a depiction of, or there are images of men in the moment of ecstasy. And so when I was making this drawing, I was thinking about queering religion and also about personal desires and conflict with a set of beliefs or faith. So study for devotional object, this one, and the next few drawings I'm showing you were all shown together in my last show at Jeff Bailey Gallery, which was in 2008. And so the work was presented in a salon style grouping of images, and it sort of comprised an overarching non-linear narrative that included queer imagery, religious imagery, almost like film stills. And these are all charcoal on paper. And this is the last drawing that I'll show you. It's from a series of crowds that I drew called Mass. And for me, Mass was referring to a crowd of people, but also referring to the religious service. And, again, thinking about the individual and the collective. And so then moving on to part two, painting, I'm going to speak specifically about two different painting projects. So the first is We Belong Together. And so after making, representational work for 14 years, I wanted to move away from my reliance on photography and also to make work that for me was a way to continue exploring identity and queer content without the use of the body, through abstraction and through painting and through color. So I began this series of diptychs called We Belong Together. And I refer to these as my same-sex diptychs. And so transitioning into painting and abstraction allowed me to work more deeply with color. I'm returning to color and to paint after 15 years of not having painted or used color. And, it was a way to think about the ways that color could elicit emotional responses, much like music. I'll talk more a little bit about color when we get to textiles. And then also in this series, I was exploring this idea of mirroring, again, sameness versus difference, the original versus the copy, symmetry and asymmetry. This series is very much inspired by and specifically references this work by Felix Gonzalez Torres, who was and still remains a huge influence on my practice. With this piece, I'm moved by the economy and the power of such a simple gesture. In this piece, he was coming to terms with the inevitability of death of his lover, who was dying of AIDS. And for me, it's this queer, poetic, and deeply personal gesture without the use of the body. And small details make this huge impact, like the way the clocks just touch each other, the idea that one will run at a time before the other. When I first saw this piece, it really had a huge impact on me, thinking about other ways of representing queerness that aren't the expected way, or like what's been expected. So I had been making this series of diptychs. At first glance, they appear to be mirror images of each other, but then, when you look closely, subtle differences begin to emerge between each of them. And then you notice that there's something just slightly off going on here. So looking at this piece now, it's funny. I can already see like into the future where I'm referencing these quilt patterns and tapestries and textiles. With these paintings, because I hadn't worked with painting in a while, I was working with. Although I would work on these multiple diptychs at a time, it would take me so much time, so many layers of working through these things. And I just wanted to make paintings quickly and get through ideas a little bit more quickly. And so then I began this year-long project in 2016 called Yearbook. Yearbook is this epic visual diary, and it's composed of 366 paintings because it was a leap year in 2016. And so I painted one painting every single day for the entire year. And so in this project, I established some self-imposed restrictions. So I would paint one painting every morning. They would each be 12 by 9 inches. I gave myself 1 hour to make the painting, and I used the timer. And then each month would be displayed in a grid according to its calendar month. And so, often people ask, how long does it take to make a painting? And for me, it was easy. It's like an hour. It took an hour to make these paintings. At the time, I wasn't thinking of them as being art. That was not the intention. It was just an exercise, a practice of working through and trying to arrive at something. And so, with this, within the restriction that I gave myself, I found tremendous freedom, with a variety of outcomes. And because I only had an hour to make each painting, it was this way for me to become resourceful with the time. It was about being present. It was also about not being too precious or too fussy, because I knew that the next day I would make another painting. Like it didn't all have to be solved in one thing, in one work. So another component to this project was that I would text an image of the completed painting to my husband every morning, and it became somewhat of a love letter over the course of the year, keeping us bound together via these images. Colors can have very specific meanings, and a few years ago, my husband, Shannon, asked me why I never used orange in my paintings because it's his favorite color. And honestly, I never really cared for it, and it never occurred to me to even use it. But I've been using it ever since, and I've grown to actually really love the color. And so that now almost all of my work that includes orange is because of him. And that's sort of, I mean, it's interesting that happened in that way. So. But sometimes, in this project, sometimes the things that I didn't like about the one piece would become the starting point for the next painting. So it was just like this continuous conversation or this continuous thread. One thing led to another. It was also a good exercise for conveying what was the most essential. I tried to exercise restraint. I have a hard time doing it, and even in this project, but a painting doesn't need to include everything, right? And so sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but I definitely learned a lot over the course of this year. This project allowed me to respond to and learn from all the failures and successes It was a way to make work without overthinking. It was this way for me to sort of accumulate a visual language that I could later reference. And it was this visual sketchbook. It was a painting sketchbook for me. Also, it was having this ritual, a daily ritual of doing this every single day became a space of certainty in a year that felt very uncertain. And so it was just sort of this grounding force, I guess you can say. And so while I was making this project, I was invited to be a visiting artist in the Fibers and Materials Studies department at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. And so I was given the opportunity to translate one of these yearbook paintings into a woven textile on a jacquard TC2 loom. First of all, I had never heard of it and I didn't know what the hell it was. And so I was fascinated right away. I was like, yeah, I don't know what this is. Let's try it. So I was there for a week and I made 3 weavings on their jacquard TC2 loom, and I absolutely fell in love with the process. This repetitive nature of throwing the shuttle back and forth to weave, I was hooked. It was meditative, and there was something very fortifying about creating a piece of cloth from yarn, having yarn and then creating something that was this physical embodiment of these paintings of mine. And so it gave me a deep respect and a greater appreciation for textiles, particularly for the process of how textiles are made and thinking more deeply about touch, right? And, because as artists, we work a lot with optics and perception. And, I like this idea of involving this idea of touch as well into my practice, and it opened up a whole realm of possibility. And so this is really where my love affair and obsession with textiles began. And what fascinates me about weaving was that it's simultaneously a structure and it's the image. It's both structure and image together. And thinking about fabric as material and an image, and thinking about fabric as sort of this stand-in for a body, because we all have this relationship to textiles and clothes, and we all wear clothes. So yeah, there was just something there. Like it was a seed that was planted, and I just became obsessed with working with textiles. And so, after doing that visiting artist gig, I went to the Textile Art Center in Brooklyn, and I just took a bunch of textile classes, sewing, weaving, dyeing, etc. And it was just like a whole new world for me, and it completely shifted the trajectory of my work. And so, this was the very first textile piece that I exhibited. And so in 2017, I was invited by Tim Dowd and Zoe Charlton to be part of a group exhibition at Syndicate. It's an artist-run space in Baltimore, Maryland. And the exhibition that they were planning was called Painting, Not Painting. And so Tim and Zoe had invited 8 artists to participate. All 8 artists worked with abstraction as a significant component to their work. But for this exhibition, they had asked each artist to not make anything that they were known for, or to show something outside of their known or typical work. And so, I had been sort of experimenting with textiles, and I was like, this is a great opportunity to just put it out in the world and just get over the fear of being afraid of these textiles. And it was the perfect opportunity to show this work. And, so it's all pieced and then sewn and then loosely woven. And, with this diptych, I imagined if grids were gay, that this is what they would probably look like. So my work often resembles flags and or quilts. And so that alludes to people and places. This piece in particular, I made at the Vermont Studio Center back in 2018. And it was made of failed sewn paintings. So I tore the paintings off the canvases and off the stretcher bars, and then I cut them up and reconfigured them into this abstract information of birds in flight. And at the time, I didn't know what this was going to be, only that I had a feeling that it should take this form. And so, it was this notion that experimentation leads to discovery and new work. This is another piece that I made at the Vermont Studio Center, that same residency. The neon fabric, the neon orange in this fabric is this safety orange. And I sourced it from the Johnson Woolen Mill over there on Main Street. And so it was originally inspired by a hand-woven tapestry from the Philippines, but it's also reminiscent of patchwork structures that you'd find in American quilt making traditions, or Gee's Bend or the Amish. But this is sort of where that image originated from for me. And this is a woven tapestry from the Philippines, which is traditionally worn by men and warriors. But it's also, I guess in the work that I make, there is an art historical lineage, thinking about fiber art, the feminist art movement in the 1960s, pattern and decoration, color field, hard edge abstraction, op art, all of that is all part of the work. But then it's also important for me to also center these other sort of references or sources of imagery and inspiration. All right, I feel like I'm talking a little too much here, so I'm just gonna go through some of these images a little bit more quickly. For the most part, these paintings, these sewn paintings, I did a bunch on a smaller scale, just out of practicality. But then when I shifted the scale, some really cool things happened. And so I found that the tension of stretching these sewn paintings over the rigid supports created this reverse effect. And so it ended up softening the rigidity and the straightness of these like hard edge paintings. And so it resulted in these like really soft, quivering geometries that I was really interested in. And then also using bilateral symmetry and mirroring. I mean, this was a way for me to think about those ideas that were happening with the same-sex diptychs, but then joining them together. And so, these are bilaterally connected, but they're also reversed, and they're mirroring each other in that way. And as I was going through these slides, this image and this image, really, I had forgotten about these, and they kind of have come back in the newer work that I'm making. So here I'm highlighting the 3/4 view of this work because I like to draw attention to the edges and to the borders of all my sewn paintings, because I feel like they're integral to the whole, to understanding the whole. And sometimes what's interesting isn't what you see straight on, but what you could experience from shifting your perspective. So what's happening in the margins of the work can be just as, if not more important to the piece. So I love color, right? Color is integral to the work that I make. In all of my work, color it's vital. I want colors to relate to and vibrate against each other in exciting ways. For me, I think of color as a material, and it becomes a formal analog to explore and reflect not only my heritage, but also a queer identity, right? This is also just to give you a sense of scale for some of these. I often say that my relationship to color is not passive. It is political, it's personal, it's emotional, it is felt, and it's in my very being. I use color and asymmetry often to create spaces that for me are dynamic and shifting, much like the idea of queerness. So here are some install shots of an exhibition, solo exhibition at Western Exhibitions in Chicago. So these were just like the original painted diptych series, but using fabric this time. So This was another series that I began a second time that I was at the Vermont Studio Center. This time it was in January 2019. And this piece, which is made up of 15 different panels, it references the flock, that very first drawing, this drawing here, the yearbook drawing that I was showed you. I was returning to this idea of sameness versus difference, the individual versus the collective. Even the title has double meaning, everyone as in the individual, or everyone as in multiplicity. So here's a detail of one of the pieces, and each one had, they're just subtle differences that happened on the edges and within each of the panels. And then this is a second grid of 9 paintings that I made as well during that same residency. And both of these sort of groupings were made specifically for a show at Patricia Sweeto Gallery in San Francisco back in 2019, when she still had her gallery there. I think she just recently moved to LA. And I was thinking about this specific grouping as a self-portrait. So all the black that you see in here are all repurposed from old studio painting jeans of mine. All right, I'm going to speed through because I feel like some other images just give you a sense of scale. All right, so here, this piece is, I like to talk about this piece because it's this tangential project that I've been working on with the rest of my work. Anytime I feel stuck in the studio, I sew fabric scraps and remnants into 8 by 8 inch blocks. Partly to keep my hands busy, but mostly to avoid overthinking the work that I'm sort of having trouble with in the studio at that particular moment. And so this is a way for me to just not really think about the work and think about something else. And so I kind of think of this as this companion to the Painting a Day series, where it's just about a process, and it's helping me to arrive at a resolution for other things. But for me, I was calling these my anxiety blocks, just because I was stuck in the studio, and I just had this pile of blocks, and I was just like they were born out of anxiety, but then I wanted to transform them into the source of comfort. And so that's when I decided I would try to make this big quilt for my bed, but then it obviously grew the size of my bed, and it's gotten to be a lot bigger than that. And while I was at Vermont this past time around, I just doubled the size of this. So it's it's grown to be this massive thing and something that will continue growing for as long as I'm making bad work, and I can recycle all the bad paintings that I've made. I can use it to feed into that piece. All right, so this is a piece that it's one of 2 site responsive installations that I made at the Bemis Center back in 2020. I wrapped a timber column in my studio space using sewn fabrics that were sourced from a visit to the Philippines in 2019. And so I wrapped all 4 sides of this column. In my studio at Bemis, I had about 15 of these columns. It was this enormous studio. And I originally had this idea to cover all of the columns, but I just didn't have enough time to do so. This is another site responsive piece that I made at Bemis, and it consists of these 3 sewn sails, which are inspired by Vinta sails, which are commonly found on outrigger boats in the southern Philippines. And so this is an image of some actual Vinta sails. And there's something that just really struck me, that these were all they're all handmade by whoever owned these boats. And it was just this idea of these like abstract paintings just floating on the water. I thought was really pretty remarkable. And there's a festival that happens every year where the shoreline is just like lined with all these different sails, and it's just really spectacular to see. So here are some other works that I did while I was at Bemis. I made these works. A lot of these reference patterns and colors of motifs in textiles from the Philippines. This was the final painting that I made for this show in Denver. And the day that I finished this painting, I found this image online of the South Philippine dwarf kingfisher. And it was the very first time that this bird had been photographed. And literally, I had just finished this painting, and then I found this picture of this bird, and it was like, how, it's such an uncanny thing. It's like, this is the same exact palette, and I'd never seen it until after I finished this. And it's a South Philippine dwarf kingfisher, and I was working on all these patterns. It was just like, just this sort of weird, uncanny thing that happened. All right, and so now we're into part 4. After BMIS, I went back home to Brooklyn, and this was in April of 2020. The city was on lockdown. I couldn't get to my studio, so this little frame room became my studio, right? So I had gone from working in this almost 3,000 square foot space in Nebraska to working on this little frame room, and so this dramatic shift to scale was. It was uncomfortable at first, but then I really got into it. And I made so many weavings every single day during lockdown. And on the right is this pile of weavings that happened. For me, it was interesting because making these weavings helped me to become technically proficient in weaving, but it also helped me to learn about optical color mixing. It gave me valuable material knowledge, or as Annie Albers put it, material intelligence. And so I think of these as drawings with yarn. And it's kind of similar to that Painting a Day series that I did back in 2016. And, with this, it's like, there's no hierarchy of importance. Everything becomes fair play. Like any mistake, I can always fix in the next piece, or each piece can give me different set of problems that I can answer in the following piece. And so at the same time that I was making these weavings, I was preparing for my first institutional solo show at the Columbus Museum in Georgia, and it was called In Dialogue with Drawing. But you can see some of here. Some of the weavings I'm referencing to work on these paintings. And so the lockdown drawings, or the lockdown weaving, were informing this work. And so for this exhibition, I was invited by Jonathan Frederick Waltz, the curator at the Columbus Museum, to select a selection of drawings and works on paper from the museum's permanent collection and make work in response to those drawings. So in the end, I chose about 40 drawings from their collection, and then I made 13 paintings and a site-responsive installation to respond to those. And so my approach to curating and presenting these drawings was mirroring the process of constructing my paintings made from sewn remnants. So I gravitated to drawings from the museum's collection that resonated and felt adjacent to my interests in color, line, place, materials, and touch. Here you see that painting that was in my studio. And here, it's next to this Robert Motherwell that I selected, and then a suite of Alma Thomas's watercolors. And so making the work in response to these drawings also made it clear how much my sewn paintings were about place and about people, using secondhand clothes from loved ones, my own clothes, and stitching fabrics from places I've visited. All the materials were imbued and invested with these memories and lived experiences. And this is soon after that Columbus Museum show opened. I had another show open in New York City at Morgan Lehman Gallery. And again, drawing played an important role in thinking about what to make for the show. And I called this show Drawdown. And so in weaving terminology, a drawdown is the graphic representation of a cloth structure or pattern. And so it's literally the drawing for how a cloth is made. And so these paintings are depictions of drawdowns. And so they're these sort of macro depictions of, little small drawings of what a cloth structure looks like. And I'm nearing the very end here. So just as drawing had made a return in recent years, I've decided to turn my attention to weaving, and because that's what completely shifted my process dramatically back in 2016. That working on that jacquard loom totally was unexpected. It totally shifted everything. And so, and it was weaving. And so I wanted to pay attention, and I wanted to return to weaving. And so, I weave every day in the studio, and I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunities to go to some residencies, and residencies have played an important role in shaping my practice, having the time, uninterrupted time and space to just make and create has been truly invaluable. So I'm still not entirely sure what the quote unquote art of these weavings or handwoven works will be, but I feel like I'm getting closer to something that feels genuine to what I want to represent. And everything is still in that slightly uncomfortable and very much work in progress phase. For me, there's a time for working and making, and then there's a time to reflect and think, and they don't necessarily happen simultaneously. I believe in this sort of 80 to 20% ratio of where about 80% of the work is really bad, but you really need to make 80% of that work to get to that 20%. And so I'm still in the 80% right now. And I wanted to end it with my studio here at the Vermont Studio Center just recently, where you can see this was one of the weavings that I had done at Haystack, and here was the one that started at Art My. And then I was working on this collective comfort quilt, which is now really big, and hopefully will be shown sometime soon. But also one last thing before I end my portion of the talk is that I just wanted to share a selection of readings or books that have been really impactful to my process. And if you want to take a screenshot, I mean, there's a lot here that I found extremely helpful. And a lot of these have also been recommended to me. And so I just wanted to give an opportunity to recommend some of these to you all. And thank you so much.